Hey Saints, this is Kent once again doing another recap video for our Sermon on the Mount Bible study. This time we're going through what was our ninth study, and we were looking at Matthew 5, verses 27 through 30. And just like with the previous couple of studies, um, Jesus is giving his teaching, giving his commandments, and he's comparing what he's saying, or really even contrasting what he's saying with what was given in the law through Moses. Okay, and now before we look at this particular passage, I just wanted to uh, remind us about the what we talked about last time, the subject of Gehenna, because that's going to come up again in this passage. Um, Rather than being understood to be a reference to hell or the lake of fire, as some translations indicate, it's best to understand Gehenna as being kind of the worst of the disciplinary judgments that can come upon a disciple of Jesus at his second coming, when he comes back. Um, if you want to know the details, you can look back at the previous videos, but it's like in Matthew 24, verses 45 through 51, Jesus has the two servants. There's the faithful servant who feeds the fellow servants, and he says he will be rewarded with, he will set him over all his possessions. He will rule with Jesus. That's the reward for the faithful servant when Jesus comes back, reigning with him in the kingdom when he comes. Um, but the unfaithful servant, it seems that the worst punishment a believer can get is that he says, give him a portion with the hypocrites, cut him asunder and give him a portion with the hypocrites. That seems to be a reference to what Jesus is talking about here, Gehenna. We linked last time the cutting asunder with the valley of slaughter that Gehenna is referred to in Jeremiah. And during the kingdom age, during that 1,000 years where Jesus rules over the earth, his disciples will either be rewarded and they will be reigning with him, or they will lose that reward and could even potentially be the worst punishment they could receive, that cast into Gehenna, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth during the course of that 1,000 years. So that's Gehenna, and we're going to see that in just a moment. Now let's look at the passage from this time. It was from Matthew 5, verse 27 and 28. Matthew 5, 27 and 28. You have heard that it was said to the ancients, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at another's wife with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So just like with the matter of murder and anger, Jesus starts with what the law says. And the law of Moses said, just like it said, you shall not murder, and the one who murders is liable to judgment, you shall not commit adultery. Now, he didn't go through the punishments that the law set up for adultery, but if you look through the Genesis through Deuteronomy, it's consistent. Adultery received the death penalty. So the law said, do not commit adultery, and Jesus comes, and he doesn't just say, avoid the external act of adultery. Jesus actually internalizes the matter, and he says, but I say to you, the one who looks at another's wife with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You know, we talked a little bit at the study that there can be a tendency to take this even further and more extreme than Jesus does. He doesn't say that if you happen to accidentally glance at someone and some amount of arousal comes up in your heart, that's not what Jesus is talking about. The Greek is clear that it's with lustful intent. You're looking in order to lust. He's saying when you do that, you have taken the first step down the path toward adultery. You've already sinned in your heart. And where the law just says, do not commit adultery, avoid the physical act, Jesus is saying that, yes, avoid the physical act, but avoid even the first step down there, down that adulterous path, which starts in your heart. We're going to touch on that a little bit more in a moment, but just want to read the remainder of the passage. So that was 27 and 28. Now we'll look at Matthew 5, the next two verses, 29 and 30. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into Gehenna. Now, we've already looked at the matter of Gehenna. And so at the study, we spoke a little bit about there's a tendency, because we know that Jesus is most likely not actually advocating for body mutilation, like chopping off of body parts or tearing out of eyeballs. So what is he actually saying? Because people kind of understand Jesus is not advocating for mutilation, they'll tend to take what he's saying metaphorically. So, okay, he says to cut off your hand. What then is the hand a metaphor for? What is it? What does the hand represent? What should we cut off from our lives in order to avoid sin or to avoid the Gehenna? And I think when we take it that way, we actually somewhat miss Jesus's point. I don't think the hand is like a metaphor for something else. I think instead of understanding Jesus to be speaking metaphorically, we should instead understand him to be speaking hypothetically. And what I mean is, hypothetically, if cutting off your hand would be the difference between reigning with Jesus in the kingdom, entering life as he says it sometimes, or going to Gehenna, if cutting off your hand was the difference, it would be better to with two hands go into the kingdom than with one hand to go into the Gehenna. Same thing with your eye. It'd be better to have one eye and enter life than two eyes to enter judgment. But so why then isn't he just advocating mutilation? Well, I want to look at another passage in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 15, starting in verse 19. Jesus is discussing with the Pharisees, and they have kind of accused him of not keeping the traditions of the elders, and they're saying, "Oh, look at your disciples; they eat with unwashed hands." And it was kind of a ceremonial cleansing that the Pharisees were saying was necessary. But listen to what Jesus says. I'll start actually in verse 18. What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles a person. As opposed to the ceremonial washing of hands or the eating of unclean foods. And then this is the key verse, verse 19. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone. Out of the heart is where murder and adultery and these great wickednesses start. It's where it comes from. And so it's not your hand, it's not your eye. Hypothetically, it would be better to cut your eye out or cut your hand off than to face judgment when you stand before Jesus. But cutting your hand off or gouging your eye out won't actually do anything. You'll just sin with your other hand, or you'll lust with your other eye. It's like the point is, it's out of the heart that these sins manifest. And Jesus had just said, when you look with lustful intent, you've already committed adultery in your heart. Don't start down that adulterous path. Even if you think, well, nobody else knows, it's just me, it's just in my own heart, God knows. Jesus will know when you stand before him at your judgment seat. And left unchecked, that adulterous heart will eventually manifest in the actual sins of adultery, murder, or any of the other that are in that list there in Matthew 15, which coincidentally are very similar to the list that we see, for example, in 1 Corinthians 6, when the Apostle Paul says, those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Adultery is on that list. So that's why Jesus warns about Gehenna. It's a accurate warning, because adultery actually does, if unrepented of, keep you out of the kingdom, and you will be a portion with the hypocrites. You will be disciplined during the coming age as opposed to rewarded. And he's not saying that every look with lustful intent does that, but adultery itself does that. And when you look with lustful intent, you've already committed adultery in your heart. And it's from the heart that these other wickednesses come. And so Jesus is telling us, just like with the anger, he will judge based on the thoughts and intentions of the heart. What you do in your own heart is not just known by you. It's known by you and by God, and you will be held accountable for it. But even beyond that, what goes on in the heart tends to grow, and it can eventually materialize into the type of sins that will keep you out of the kingdom when Jesus comes. And so that was what Jesus had to say about adultery. And next week, we're going to be looking at the next section where Jesus talks a little bit more specifically about marriage. And again, he's going to contrast what he has to say versus what we read about in the law of Moses. So look forward to speaking with you then.